The enclosed document was found by a deep space xenoarchaeological team 1 month ago. Keep in mind that this is a preliminary translation. We are still working on some aspects of the language involved. Nevertheless, given the obvious cultural significance of this work, I have decided to forward the data and translation we currently have. The team involved is researching SETI 6779 Beta, a Class H planet orbiting a Class 5 star. The planet once supported a people that referred to themselves as the Mourner. The Mourner were, as far as we can determine, essentially human. At its peak, their civilization and technology level are believed to have been roughly the same as ours, though we do not believe that they ever developed FTL travel or transmission capabilities. Approximately 10,000 years ago, the Mourner apparently ceased to be. We do not know why or what happened to them, and that was the primary question the Deep Space team was sent to try and answer. While the team learned much about them, unfortunately the eventual fate of the Mourner remains a mystery. The most surprising discovery the team made was an octahedron, measuring exactly 9 meters between each termination, that had been placed on dark side of the smaller of the planet's 2 moons. A perfect, obviously grown, single diamond crystal. The team believes that it was purposefully placed there to preserve it. A kind of cultural record for any who might come later, much as our own Darkside Vault project. Each face of the diamond was carved with various texts and representations. The Mourner were careful to allow for enough information that we could start to build a translation database, which the team quickly got to work on. Occupying an entire face of the diamond, obviously something considered to be of great importance to the Mourner, was the document I present here. Given its obvious significance, the team worked on translating it first, and once they realized what it was about, they quickly beamed all of their data to Terra 1. There is still much of the text on the diamond to be translated, and I will not speculate on what else we may find. The team believes that the diamond was placed on that moon not very much before the Mourner ceased to be, perhaps only a few hundred years before. The document itself was clearly written much earlier in their history. Based on what of the historical texts have been so far analyzed, it is believed that the events described in this text occurred roughly 4,000 years before the end of the Mourner, making it approximately 14,000 years ago. Given the contents of the document, I am at something of a loss. When you have read it, you will know why I say that. Whether releasing it should be the province of EarthGov, an All Church, or some other entity is something that will have to be decided by the Council. I do know that if something is not done soon, we run the risk of it getting out regardless. Too many people know of it. My entire division staff has been in an uproar ever since we received the Deep Space Team's transmission. To be honest, I am somewhat surprised, if gratified, that it has not hit the network already. My recommendation, for what it's worth, is that it be released immediately. Despite being a preliminary translation, our confidence in it is quite high, and what questions remain involve debates over minor political and cultural terms. Lorraine M. Johnston DIV Head DSA EarthGov Central Kyrie Liaison, Hira renounces teachings. The Whipmaster screamed. No, Marcus replied, his voice quiet and no longer defiant. The whip lashed out and struck Marcus across the chest, leaving a bloody line and quickly rising welt on his already tortured body. Marcus was so far gone that he barely cringed and only emitted a soft moan of pain. Chained to the pole in the center of the square, he could no longer even hold himself up. He simply hung by the manacles around his wrists. A few of the guards laughed at Marcus' condition, others looked on in amazement at the amount of punishment Marcus had taken. A crowd of spectators had formed in the last hour, perhaps 50 people. Worthless people, did they enjoy this? Were they hoping to see a man die? Didn't they even care? Only the Whipmaster seemed to show no emotion. Deny him, the Whipmaster said, say that he is not a prophet, not a man of God, and all of this will end. I cannot, Marcus said after a long moment, his voice so soft that only the movement of his lips gave away the words. I turned away as the whip came crashing down on Marcus' nearly nude body yet again. Hiding my face in my sleeve of my dress, I wiped away the tears, but it was useless. There were ever more to replace them. I cried not just for my friend, but for us all. How much more could Marcus take? If only I could tell him the truth and end this. Or would Marcus deny the man he called Lord even if he knew the truth? Marcus was such a noble man, such a good man, perhaps even then he would not deny him. The whipmaster went to Marcus and, grabbing Marcus' hair, lifted his head to look into his eyes. "Do you love him?" the whipmaster asked. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice clear. "Then you will die with him." The whipmaster released Marcus and turned, motioned to the guards, and then walked away. The guards released Marcus from the whipping pole and led him away, back to prison. The spectators started to disperse, the entertainment done. Tomorrow few of them would even remember what Marcus had looked like, fewer still would ever know why he had been whipped. I stood there, staring at that horrid pole, the marks countless whips had made upon it, the drops of blood in the sand. I wanted to cry, to scream, to rail at the heavens, but I could not. It had all left me. I was empty of emotion save for the tears still in my eyes. How could things have gone so wrong? I wondered as I turned away from that horrible sight. How could we have been so wrong? How could he have lied to us like that? He was Huron, I'd seen the scar myself. All that time and he'd never told us. Never told me. The blind leading the blinder. The market street was crowded this time of afternoon. The narrow way nearly blocked by all manner of vendors hawking all manner of wares on both sides of the street. I should have chosen another way, but there seemed little point to going back now. I didn't want to be in that horrible square and see that horrible pole again. As I approached the portal marking the entrance to the eastern city, I noticed a soldier eyeing me. I kept my head down, trying not to attract his attention, but as I walked through the portal he grabbed my arm and roughly pulled me aside. "Aren't you one of the women who follows the false prophet?" the soldier demanded. I said nothing, eyeing him angrily. He cocked an eyebrow, clearly unsure. "But you do not appear to be whore." "Certainly not," I said, shocked, pulling my arm out of his grasp. "What is your name, soldier?" "Why?" the soldier asked, caught off guard and suddenly on the defensive. "I wish to speak to my father about being detained like this," I said, knowing full well that my father was a long ways away and would not have come to my defense anyway. "What is your name?" "There is no need for that, Mississippi." "My apologies, it was a simple mistake." "Fine," I said, and walked off in a huff before he could recover his wits. Marcus had not denied his lord or his beliefs under pain of torture or even threat of death. And here I had denied him, Zakar, denied my beliefs, when faced with nothing more than a confused soldier. But Marcus hadn't known the truth, I did. I stopped by the side of an ally and started crying again. How could he have betrayed me? I was born in the province of Sirong. My father was Matthew, a landowner, farmer, and the head of the regional council. My mother was Marina, said to be the most beautiful woman in the province and the most talented weaver. My parents were wealthy, second only to the regional governor, and I was destined from birth to be a Senate member and perhaps even more. My birth name was Matthias. There, I've said it. I was born a little boy, I am now a woman. I am Hira. From my youngest memories I knew that something was wrong with me. I did not wish to play with little boys, preferring instead to play with girls. As I grew, I did not yearn for the robes of my father, instead I desired the beautiful dresses my mother made. I did not wish to be a farmer, I wanted to be a weaver like my mother. I was always at odds with what others, especially my parents, wanted of me, but I could not seem to change how I felt. I don't remember when it was I figured out exactly what was wrong with me, but I do know I was very young and I do remember attempting to discuss it with my mother. I thought that she might be understanding, at least more understanding than my father, but she was not. She was horrified and told me that these were unclean thoughts. That if I did not deny them I would be godless and would die horribly and burn forever in a pit of fire with the godless heathens. She threatened to talk to the head priest about it, even to see about having me sent to a monastery, but she never did. It was not long after that my grandmother, then a middle-aged and very wise woman, came into my room and spoke to me about it. She was, at least, understanding, if not exactly sympathetic. She talked for a long time, and for the first time I realized that I was not the first person ever born feeling this way. That, despite her warnings about the dangers of my feelings, gave me hope for perhaps the first time in my life. My grandmother refused to speak of the matter anymore. Despite the little hope she had given me, over the months that followed I became despondent, depressed. I even started having thoughts of death. Even at such a young age I knew that I could not live with what was inside me, who I was never being able to come out and be free. My mother saw this and was greatly saddened. Against my father's wishes, she sent me to stay with my grandmother for the cold season. My grandmother also saw this in me and finally she relented. We spoke about it twice more. It was in our third discussion that she first mentioned the hiranji, the hiran, and the hira. I believe that by then she had finally decided that what I was telling her was real, how I really was and felt, and not just some passing childish passion. Despite phrasing everything as a warning of potential doom, she gave me a way out. A way I could be myself. That knowledge lifted my spirits and I was much improved when I returned to my father's house at the start of the growing season. I hid my secret well after that, biding my time. Unbeknownst to my parents, I was preparing, gathering the things I would need for a long trip. When I was 10.5 years I left home in the dead of night. I took an ass and attached it to a wagon that I'd filled with what provisions I felt I would need for the long trip. I swore never to return. What I was about to do would disgrace my family and make me godless and unclean. I was sorry that it would hurt my parents, that I would never grow into the man my mother and father wanted, but I had no choice. The hiranji lived in the western mountains of the farthest eastern valley of the known world. It was at least 100 days away. My grandmother had called them symbiotes, though I wasn't sure what that was. They were a kind of worm that would invade man or beast through the belly and live within you. They changed you, making you no longer what you were before. A person invaded by a hiranji was bonded to them forever. Hiranji were believed to be offspring of the serpent from the beginning story. They were considered pure evil. A person invaded by them was said to be godless, to have no soul, to be in the service of evil. Animals that had been invaded by hiranji were slain, their carcasses burned. People who had been invaded, if it was known, were feared and shunned. Treated worse than lepers. It was rare for an animal to be invaded, the hiranji themselves were rare and the farmers knew to keep their beasts well clear of the mountain on which they bred. It was unheard of for a person to be invaded. You had to capture one and let it invade you, and no one was going to let that happen to them. No one, that is, except for people like me. No one knew why. My grandmother said that it was simply their demonic nature, but when the hiranji invaded a person or an animal it changed that creature's sex. A bull would become a cow, or a woman would become a man. Or a boy would become a woman. If he survived the process, anyway, many did not. I didn't care, this was my only hope. It took me 4 passings of the small moon, longer than I had expected, to reach the valley and make camp on the side of the mountain. My provisions were getting very low by then, and I was afraid the cold months would overtake me before I could complete my task. I was lucky, though. I found a hiranji with amazing ease, and I took this as a sign that it was meant to be. Now all I needed was a place where I would be undisturbed during and after the hiranji was within me. According to the old stories my grandmother had told me, the transformation took much out of one, leaving a person helpless or even unconscious for a time. Sometimes for a long time. It was unclear from the stories just how long a long time could be. I was lucky there as well. Traveling up the mountain I had run into a cave. It was large enough for me, my supplies, and the ass, but not large enough for the wagon. I set up camp inside the cave, unhooked the docile ass and lead him into the back of the cave, then started a fire. I sat and had a meal, nearly the last of the food I'd brought with me. If I survived this I would have to hunt for food until I could reach the closest village. If I survived. I stared into the fire for a long time, watching the flames dance, watching the shadows play across the hard cold soul of the mountain. Despite how much I wanted this, how much I needed this, how much I had gone through to get here, I was afraid. Or perhaps I was afraid because of how much I needed this, I didn't know. I was alone, a frightened child far from home on a quest that even I knew was foolhardy. Seeking something that, if I achieved it, would change my life forever in ways that I couldn't imagine. And if I didn't achieve it I would be gone, dead, gone. Even if the hiranji didn't kill me, if I didn't go through with it, I couldn't live the rest of my life the way I was. A high cliff, a jump into a fast-moving river, there were many ways. I had thought about them only too often before. I cried a little then, always a weakness of mine that had forever vexed my parents. Any way I went my immortal soul was forfeit. God would never let a creature like me into paradise. My grandmother was wrong about one thing. I didn't believe the hiranji were evil any more than a dog is. No, God didn't forsake the Hiran and Hira because of the hiranji that had infected them. God had forsaken us the day we were born. I wiped my eyes and stood. I'd come this far, what else could I do? I went to the pile of my things and retrieved the small jar I had trapped the hiranji in. It was wiggling still, but away from its native soils it was weakening quickly. I had to do this now or never. I removed my tunic and lay down on my sleeping pallet. I held up the jar again, looking at the creature that would soon share my body. It was much smaller than I had expected. From the stories I'd been expecting it to be a huge monster the size of my arm. Instead it was more the size of my index finger and I was not a very large child. Such a small thing, how could it do what I wanted, needed? I took it out of the jar carefully and placed it on my chest. At first I worried that nothing would happen, that it was too weak, as it seemed to just lay there for a moment. But suddenly it was moving far faster than I had thought it could, pausing on my belly just above the birth hole. It rose its head up and opened its mouth, exposing for the first time 5 chitinous teeth. It plunged into my belly with ferocious speed. The pain was phenomenal, far more than I'd ever imagined possible, and before I could even fight off the reflex to swipe it off of me, it was gone. It was inside me, and the small hole it had made in my belly was already seeming to seal itself. That hole would eventually heal into the small star-shaped scar that forever marked all Hiran and Hira. I lay back, wiping the sweat from my brow, and took a deep breath. The pain had stopped. Was it over? That thought was met with another, thankfully brief, stab of pain deep within my belly. But there was no change. I still felt the same and, from what I could see, looked the same. I don't know how long I laid there, again crying. It hadn't worked. All of this, all my effort and hope and everything for naught. I had actually sat up, despondent, when it hit me. Waves of pain that made my previous trials seem like nothing. I fell back down, barely able to move. Every part of my body felt like it was being torn apart. I was sure I was dying. This was going to kill me after all. I could not endure the pain and, thankfully, I passed out. I was in a bed when I woke up. In a comfortable bed in a room somewhere. It was dark, nighttime. My mind was muddled, confused, as I got out of the bed. How did I come to be here? I looked down as I stood. Someone had dressed me in a simple night slip. A girl's night slip. Had it worked? I hurriedly turned up the wicks on the 2 lamps attached to the wall opposite the bed and went to the mirror as the lamps flared to life. My hair, which had been short in the fashion of boys, was now long and unruly, in bad need of some attention. My face, though, looked basically the same. I had lost a lot of weight, and I hadn't had much to lose to begin with, giving me a rather gaunt look and making it hard for me to judge if my face really had changed much, if at all. But my eyes! They had been blue, and now they were green. I thought I could see other changes, but it was hard to say, and I wouldn't know until I regained a few stone. I felt the same, and it was impossible to know how long I had been unconscious, leaving the cause of the weight loss and the longer hair in question. My body, what I could discern of it, seemed to be basically the same. Had it worked? There was only one way to know for sure. Tentatively, afraid of the answer, I reached down and felt my groin through the thin cloth of the night slip. It had worked. I was changed. It had worked. I was a girl now. I danced a quick dance of joy, that little bit wearing me out and informing me in no uncertain terms of just how weak in a state I was in. I went to the small window and opened it, gazing out. The wind was cold, there was a light coat of snow on the ground. I was on the 2nd floor of some large building made of wood. Across the way was a town center. I recognized none of it, and knew not where I was. Both moons were low in the sky. Between that and the snow it was clear that I had been unconscious for quite some time, far longer than I would have guessed. How had I come to be here? Had someone found me and brought me to their town? Did they know? They must, the wound would not be fully healed even now. They knew I was Hira but had saved me? That didn't seem very likely. How, then? How had I come to be here? My wonderings were shattered by the sound of the door opening behind me. I spun around, the shock of recognition washing over me as the person in the doorway, equally shocked, dropped the tray of food they were carrying. "Grandmother," I said, bowing my head respectfully as she kicked aside the utensils and pieces of the shattered bowl, then closed the door behind her. My own voice sounded odd in my ears, but I was too surprised to take much notice. "You have some learning to do, my grandchild," she said. "A curtsy would be more appropriate, don't you think?" I had to smile at that, despite her stern tone, and I curtsied as best I knew how, then had to suppress the urge to do another little dance. "Work on it," my grandmother advised, sitting in the weave chair by the door. "I'm glad to see you up and about, child. For a long time I thought we were going to lose you." "How did I come to be here, grandmother?" I asked. "When I found out you were gone," my grandmother said with a sigh, "I knew what you intended. I told your parents and they were furious with you, especially your mother. Your father wanted to send some men after you to stop you, but I forbade him. That made him even angrier, but he obeyed me. That evening I set off with 6 of your father's men, intending to catch up with you and try and talk you out of this madness. But we were waylaid, had to fight off bandits twice on the road, and when we finally did find you, it was in that cave. You were very lucky one of the men spotted that cave. You were very near death." "Better death as a girl than life as a boy," I said quietly, going to the bed and sitting down. So you apparently feel, she said. I'm sorry, grandmother, I mean no disrespect, but you cannot know how I feel. I can't? You are not the first person born, child, nor the first to feel the way you do. Nor are you the first person in our family to suffer thusly. What in the name of the 13 prophets did she mean by that? Me, child, she said after a moment, me. I was wife to your grandfather, mother to your mother and your uncle, but I have never been a woman, not inside, and I have always known it. I know only too well how you feel. That is why you knew all of the stories of the hiranji, I said, the realization hitting me like a falling tree. Of course. I first heard stories when I was not much older than you are now. I spent many years searching out knowledge about them. What little is known, anyway. I knew that you would eventually hear some of the same stories I had. I hoped that by telling you about them I could dissuade you from doing something rash and foolish. So much for that hope. How could you have gone and done this? How could you have not? I asked, feeling her anguish. Have I taught you nothing? Because it's wrong, this is wrong, the hiranji are evil. The hiranji are not evil, grandmother, that is a myth. I have read through every one of the sacred texts, there's not even a mention of the hiranji, the hiran, or the hira. How can we be evil? So now you are an expert on the sacred texts? None of that matters. Do you know how people think? What they will think of you if they knew. Then they shall not know, I said defiantly. And what kind of life will that be for you? I don't know, I admitted. No, you don't, she said, shaking her head. Am I now evil, grandmother? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, she said, then shook her head again. No, child, I cannot believe you are. You are my own flesh and blood, my grandchild. I cannot believe you are evil. There were tears in her eyes and I went to her, she held me close, rocking me, kissing the top of my head. I'm sorry, grandmother, I said, truly meaning it. I know, child, I know. I wish you had not chosen this path, but it's done. She held me for a long while, for the first time in many passings of the moons I did not feel so alone. Stand, she finally said, and I did. Turn, let me see you. I did. You've changed so much, hardly the little boy you were. I've lost a lot of weight, I said. It's not that, she said, dismissing the notion with a wave of her hand. You look like your mother did at your age. All gangly legs and arms and pretty eyes, like a newborn foal. You are lucky, you will be a beautiful woman just as your mother is. She sighed. Or perhaps not so lucky. Beauty carries its own price, especially for one such as you are now. I will deal with whatever may come, I said. Did she really think I would be beautiful? I'm sure you shall, child. What will you call yourself now? Have you thought of that? I took a deep breath. Mary, grandmother, I am Mary. A good name, she said, nodding approvingly. And where will you go now, Mary? I do not know, I said with a shrug. She smiled. I didn't imagine you had thought that far ahead. We will discuss it, but first I will go and get you some more food. You need to regain your strength before you go anywhere. Kyrie Alaison, a new beginning. My grandmother had brought 6 men with her, but I hardly saw them at all. Chasing after me must have cost her a small fortune. Not that she wasn't very wealthy and able to draw on my father's wealth if she needed to, but she never made mention of any of it. She stayed with me for 7 days while I regained my strength. We talked much and she helped me to formulate a plan. I couldn't go home, not ever, and I couldn't really stay in the village I was in. There was too much chance someone would find out I was Hira. That only left going somewhere I would not be known. It would not be easy, especially as I was so young and relatively unskilled, but with some effort I could make a new life for myself. She also taught me things about my new body. Female things that most girls learned from their mothers when the time was right, but which I would have to deal with on my own. Some of it shocked me. I'd had no idea, but I tried to deal with it in as adult a manner as I could. I would have to know about my body and I would have to be an adult, one way or the other, from then on. She also taught me about men and women, sex, and about babies. Useless knowledge, as we both knew that no man would take a Hira as his wife, but it was best that I knew. And she taught me about the clothes and customs of women, most of which I already knew, and about how to care for my now longer hair and how to make myself look more fetching or more plain as however I might need. She bought me a dress I could wear, and on the third day after I had come to I was well enough to leave my room for the first time. My room was over a large tavern. A clean place, as such things go. The proprietor was a large and rather stern man, though nice enough to me. His wife, equally large, was very nice to me. The village we were in was called Jiller. It was half-day's ride from where my grandmother and her men had found me. The people seemed nice enough and they all seemed to know my grandmother. They were relatively well off. Most of the buildings were newer. And most of the buildings were wooden. Amazing to me, so used was I to the dark brick and adobe buildings of the lowlands. This high in the mountains with the harsh winters and snow, though, adobe would never do. It was all so very different from the lands I knew. Tall trees everywhere and most of the people I saw seemed heavier, as if to shield themselves from the cold. I was quite sure that I was the smallest person in Jiller by far. Too soon, my grandmother had to go. I cried so profusely when she told me her men were packing her things. Whatever small amount of emotional self-control I may have once possessed seemed to have been left behind with my old body. I had so many more questions, so much more to learn, but mostly I needed her. In the days since I had awoken I think she had come to accept what I had done, if not quite approve. And in a way it was perhaps a vicarious thing for her. I knew she had to go. The early snows had already been and gone and soon the true cold season would descend upon Jiller. She needed to get back to her lands, and to have any chance of doing so she had to leave soon. I knew all of this, but I did not want to be alone. I will have to take the ass with me, your father wants it back, my grandmother said. My heart sank. I had been counting on having the ass to haul the wagon. Without it I would have to sell the wagon. Don't worry, child, I will leave you a horse for your wagon, she said with a smile, clearly reading my thoughts in my expression. Thank you, I said. I sat on the bed in her room and watched as she dressed in her traveling clothes. It somehow no longer seemed odd to watch another woman, let alone my own grandmother, dress. The mysteries of a woman's body were no longer mysteries, and someday my body would look something like hers did. It seemed almost anticlimactic, and yet exciting at the same time. Your room is paid up through the cold season. I expect you'll be doing what we discussed? Yes, I said, nodding. Good. You will find provisions and supplies in your wagon. I've paid for the wagon and the horse I'll leave you to be stabled through the winter. Thank you, I said again. How could I ever thank her enough for all that she had done for me? It's the least I could do, child, she said, putting on her cloak. She stood in front of me and took my hands into hers. It was the least I could do, Mary. I wish I didn't have to leave you here alone like this. You know why I must? I nodded. We've both chosen our paths. I nodded again and she gently pulled me to her, hugging me. I'm sorry, I said, tears washing my face. No, she said, tears in her voice, don't ever be sorry, Mary. Don't ever be sorry. I love you, grandmother, I said, trying to smile. And I love you, granddaughter, she said, gently kissing my forehead. Always remember I love you, Mary. She released me and, taking my hand, led me to the door. Now I am going to go downstairs and be on my way. You are going to stay up here for me? I could not bear seeing you while I have to ride off. I nodded, again trying to smile and only half succeeding. Oh, she said, pausing after opening the door, you will find 2 chests in the wagon with a few things in them that you might find useful. Old things that you can put to much better use than I ever did. And you will find some money in a sack hidden under your mattress. Be careful with the money, it is all you'll have. I bit my lip, tears filling my eyes again. Have care on your journey, grandmother. Happiness and good life. Happiness and good life to you, Mary. She kissed me again on the forehead. I worry so for you, such a young girl by herself in the world. She shook her head. Have care, child, and always remember that you are loved. The door closed and she was gone. I sat on what had been her bed and cried, feeling the weight of the mountains upon my slim shoulders. I was alone. As we had planned, I spent the cold months in Jiller. Everyone was pleasant enough, but clearly there were many questions as to why a girl my young age would be left on her own. No one asked, though, and I offered no explanation. For the most part one kept to myself. In a sack beneath the mattress in my room were 6 gold coins, as much as many families make in 2 years and more than enough, if I was careful, for me to support myself for quite some time. Hopefully I would not need to. The contents of the 2 chests in my cart were even more surprising. There were numerous dresses, underthings, jewelry, hair combs, even a small bottle of what must have been expensive perfume and a few other feminine cosmetics. All of it very lovely, most of it quite expensive. What surprised me most was a necklace of Selena, something any respectable unattached young woman would be wearing. It, like most of the things in the chests, must have been my grandmother's when she was young. Things she must have preserved to perhaps pass on to her granddaughter, a granddaughter that up to now she'd never had. Things she must have decided she wished to pass on to me. More than anything else, it told me how much she really did understand. The gesture surprised, thrilled, and saddened me all at the same time. By the time the cold months were coming to an end, I had regained some of the weight I'd lost, though my body seemed to refuse to regain it all. By then even I could see how much I'd changed and how much I was still changing. I had also started to overcome some of my sadness. I had achieved something I'd never truly thought possible. My grandmother had helped much and I never would have survived without her. That she had, in the end, understood meant the world to me. It gave me the strength I needed to go on. My whole life was in front of me, what better adventure could there be? The tavern keeper and his wife were greatly saddened as I finally started packing my things and bringing them to my cart. No doubt I was one of the better patrons they'd had in quite some time, a thought that made me smile. Though I had come to genuinely like them both and they had taken good care of me after my grandmother's departure, I was not going to be sad to leave Jiller behind. It was just too different from what I'd known all my life. I got my cart packed to my satisfaction and a stable hand kindly helped me with harnessing the horse. I was glad for that. The horse was quite large and my strength, like my weight, had never fully returned and likely never would. Not that harnessing a horse to a cart wouldn't have been a task to give me pause even at the best of times. When I came down from my room for the last time, wearing my new riding dress and a cloak wrapped tightly around me, the tavern keeper and his wife were waiting. She hugged me, asking for at least the 100th time if I really had to go. She had been trying to convince me to stay ever since it had become clear that I was going to leave, even promising me a room and a job in the tavern. It was a very kind offer, but I didn't feel I could stay even though my worries about someone in town discovering that I was Hira had abetted with the passing moons. The tavern keeper echoed his wife's offer and, when I politely declined, told me again about the dangers of the road. He was right, what I was doing was not the safest thing. My big worry was bandits. If I was set upon, I would be completely helpless. But I felt I had no choice, I had to hope for the best. I thanked them profusely for their hospitality and then left. I was lucky. Perhaps it was still too cold for bandits to be about, or perhaps they were about and, spying a young girl, decided that I wasn't worth the bother. If any bandits had been given any idea of how much wealth I was carrying, both the gold coins and the jewelry, dresses, and other items, I probably would have barely made it out of town. I knew I was going to have to be careful about that. As a young girl all on my own, I would be an easy target. It took me 2 days to make it down and out of the mountains, and it was another day before I reached the first decent-sized town from Jiller. I stayed the night there and moved on. The town I wanted was another 5 days away. I was near exhaustion by the time I reached Milan. Taking care of the horse and spending my nights by the side of the road in restless sleep, when I could sleep, had taken its toll on me. I found a temporary place to stay and rested, boarding the horse and wagon in a nearby stable. Milan was much as my grandmother had described it, not all that different from where I'd grown up. The people of Milan were nice enough, but far more free with their questions as to why a young girl was alone than those of Jiller had been. I told them a story my grandmother and I had concocted about how my parents had died and I had been sent to live with my grandmother. As she was not well and not able to bear the burden of caring for me, I had run away to make my own way in the world. This, of course, struck people oddly, but it was plausible enough, seemed almost noble of me, and they accepted it and me. Finding work turned out to be even easier than I had expected. As had happened in Jiller, the tavern owner offered me work and board. This time I accepted. The work was nothing special, sweeping and cleaning and some serving during the busy hours, nor was the pay. But it was enough for me. My life fell into a regular, even comfortable, pattern. From early afternoon through late into the night I would work in the tavern. Eventually I was doing more cooking and serving than cleaning, and for the most part the rest of my time was mine. I spent most of that time trying to learn the craft of my mother, weaving. I endlessly pestered some of the old women of the town and learned what I could. I lacked my mother's skill, of course. At first I had no idea what I was doing. But I had deft hands and a burning desire. I quickly learned and my skills grew every day. Shortly after I entered my 14th year I quit my work at the tavern. I had become apprenticed to the best weaver in the region. It was also in my 14th year that other problems started. I was well and truly coming into my full womanhood as any girl my age would. Most of the girls of the town who were my age were already married, more than a few with child. I had suitors ever since my 13th year, both boys and men who wanted me. But I ignored them all, keeping to myself as best I could. Talk had started, they thought I didn't hear but I did, that I might be Holler, a woman who loves other women. Would that it was so, life would have been much simpler if that was all that it was. But no, I was Hira, and while being Holler was acceptable, if considered odd, being Hira was not. There were several of my suitors that I could have taken to, and a few I was very attracted to, but they could never have me. For if any man ever had me, he would see the scar eventually and know the truth. That I could never allow. Much as it pained me, I would never be a bride. So I allowed the rumors to continue and I kept to myself, rebuking any potential suitor before he could be a problem. That worked well enough, if painfully, until my mid-16th year. One particular young man named Peter had taken an interest in me and would not take no for an answer. No matter how stern I was with him, he kept coming back. And, unlike some of my previous potential suitors, there was nothing charming nor flattering about his attentions. The son of a provincial senator, Peter was an arrogant braggart. I was not attracted to him in the least, and deflecting his attentions gave me some minor pleasure. But his persistence worried me. It worried me a lot. It was the hottest day of the year when it happened. Despite no longer working there, I was still living in a small room in the back of the tavern. The rent was reasonable and I liked the tavern owner. I liked being there. I had just come home from a hard day. I was working very long hours. My skills had grown to be almost equal those of my teacher. In some ways I was the better, and there was great demand for our product throughout the province. I had undressed and wiped myself with a wet rag, trying to cool down. I should have been getting dressed again to go get some dinner, but I was enjoying the slight breeze through the window across my nude body. I admit to being vain and stupid. I loved the changes my body was going through, even the messier aspects, and the idea, no matter that it was unlikely, that someone could walk by and see the upper half of my nude body through the window gave me a thrill. My evil thoughts were quickly rewarded. There was a bang on the door and it opened. I spun around, shocked, my right arm going up to cover my breasts, my left hand going down to cover my groin as best I was able. Peter was standing there, a leer on his face. His intentions in breaking into a woman's room were disgustingly clear. You would think that in his obviously drunken state he would miss something so small, that he would have focused on other, to men more interesting, parts of my anatomy. But no, his eyes focused on my belly, on that damnable scar, as if it was lit up by a bright sunbeam. His jaw dropped open and he fell backwards, passing out either from shock, the booze, or both. His head hit the hard stone of the entrance with a sickening thud. I was in trouble, very, very, very deep trouble. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to tell myself that this hadn't happened. That after all of this time I hadn't been caught out so easily, so thoroughly. But I had, there was no denying it. I was in serious trouble. I grabbed a sheet off of my bed and wrapped it around me. Going to him I felt for a pulse and found it. I wasn't sure whether I should be happy or sad that he was still alive, still breathing. Acting on instinct, I pulled him into my room and quickly shut the door, hoping no one else had seen him. I quickly threw on a dress and braided my hair, then started packing everything I had of value into my grandmother's 2 chests. I knew I would have to leave a lot of things behind, there just wasn't time. I had no idea how long he would be unconscious. As drunk as he'd obviously been, it would hopefully be enough time for me to get away. I knew how it would go once he awoke and told his story. Forget that he had broken into a woman's room uninvited and with obvious ill intentions. No, that would not be mentioned. The story would be of the evil Hira shockingly in their midst. Likely it would be said that I was trying to seduce him, never mind that he had been about to attack me. I would be the demoness trying to turn their men to evil, and it wouldn't matter that I had lived there peacefully for many years. It wouldn't matter what I said or did, and I shuddered to think what the townspeople might do to me. I had to leave, and leave quickly. It took me 3 trips to get as much as I felt I could carry from my room to the stable and into my cart. My fear lent me strength, or I never would have gotten that much. Luck was with me, no one was about at that hour, and I was able to get my things to the cart, get the horse hitched up, and leave without running into another soul. I drove my horse hard, not resting that night or the next day. I finally hid deep within a stand of trees and rested. I was safe, at least for now, but my life in Milan was gone. Destroyed by my vanity and stupidity and by a man who'd thought to take advantage of me. For the first time it hit me. It had all been academic before, a simple exercise in having some care. For the first time it really hit me how precarious my life could be simply because I was something different from most. No matter how much I tried, no matter how much good I did, it could all be taken away in a single moment. I cried late into the night as my horse worriedly watched. Kyrie, the meeting I eventually settled in Takla, a city 16 days' travel from Milan. A provincial capital, Takla was far enough both from Milan and from my home province that I felt I would be safe. A large city, larger than any I'd ever seen, I hoped that its great crowds would allow me more anonymity than I'd had in Milan. I quickly found work as a house girl in a large villa owned by a wealthy merchant. The work was easy enough, the pay was better than I'd ever known and included board in a small cottage next to a garden. Still, it wasn't what I wanted to be doing, but I felt that trying to get work as a weaver would be too dangerous. Too much risk of running into a guild member who knew my previous mistress or may have known of me. Too much chance of the whole disaster that had happened in Milan coming back to haunt me. Things had changed quite a lot for me. I was now far more distrustful of people than I ever had been before. Where before I had kept to myself mostly, but been polite and friendly enough to all, I now felt openly hostile towards anything I perceived as an invasion of my space, my privacy. At times I could be downright nasty about it. Gone was my previous friendliness and with it much meaningful contact with others. And gone with that was much of my happiness. Prudent or not, I liked being around others and having friends. But I couldn't. I couldn't take the risk of letting anyone close to me again for fear that my life would be destroyed again. I had become angry and bitter and I knew it and didn't like seeing it in myself. But I knew not what else to do, how else to be and still remain safe. In my off time I still practiced my craft, and in the 2 years that passed since my coming to Takla my skills had grown greatly. I was proud of my work, even if my craft was no longer my occupation. My avocation was discovered by the mistress of the villa quite by accident one day. Her name was Mary also, and she was the closest thing to a friend that I had then. Very friendly with the staff, especially for a woman of her position, she had seemed to have taken a particular interest in me. She was never intrusive, though, nor overly inquisitive or persistent. Those traits, combined with the ill will it would generate if I was in the least rude to the wife of the owner of the villa, combined to allow her to get closer to me than anyone else, despite my best intentions. One day she was visiting my cottage on some pretext or other, and she happened to spy a pile of cloth I had weaved, going through the samples as we talked. I hardly noticed, the work in that pile was hardly my best, but she was surprised by what she saw and wanted to know where I had gotten cloth of such quality. I told her, and then showed her some of my better work. Materials I'd made that I was truly proud of. She was stunned. It felt good to have someone again appreciate my work, and asked me if I could make some materials for her, perhaps sew her some dresses while I was at it. Only then did I realize my mistake. It was okay, though. She didn't want anyone outside of the villa to know where she was getting her material from, mostly because she was afraid that another of the ladies in the city would try and steal away my services. That was more than fine with me, of course, and she commissioned me to make a bolt of a particular kind of cloth for her with promise of much more weaving work if I could produce what she wished and if I was willing. I was more than willing, and quickly I was spending more time weaving and later weaving and sewing than I was working in the house. Less than half a year later I had no more duties in the house and was spending all of my time weaving and producing special dresses and garments for my mistress to be seen in. She rewarded me richly for my work and never asked why it was a weaver of my skills was willing to work so privately. I was on my way to market to purchase thread and pick up a new shuttle for my loom from the metalsmith when I met him. I had stopped by the eastern well pool on my way to market. Even at that early hour it was warm, the day would be an extremely hot one, and I was thirsty. I had drank some from the cool waters and was about to turn away and resume making my way to the market when I heard a voice. A man talking, a man with the sort of voice that commanded you to listen. A voice you could not ignore. I turned and saw him. There were 3 other men with him, but my eyes were drawn to him alone. He was a massive man, perhaps the tallest man I'd ever seen, and well-muscled in the way of a man who'd spent many an hour toiling in the fields. Or perhaps he was a warrior. But he wore no armor, only a cotton tunic and simple robes. He was older than I, of that I was sure, but by how much it was impossible for me to guess. His skin was sun-darkened, his hair was long, more in the fashion of women than of men, but unruly. His beard was equally unruly. But none of that hardly signified, it was his eyes that drew you. Deep blue pools that seemed almost sad. Eyes that were almost too large for his face. Eyes that seemed to see all, seemed to not look at you, but instead into you. I must have looked the fool, standing there staring at this vision of a man with my jaw agape. He seemed not to notice, though, and calmly walked up to me, the 3 other men, seeming somehow lesser, following him at some distance. "Good morning, miss," he said, bowing his head in more deference than our relative positions warranted. The men with him did likewise. What an incredible voice, I thought. A deep bass, it seemed like it would carry for miles, and yet it was so soft, his speech so quiet, as to be pitched for my ears alone. Good morning, sir," I haltingly replied, curtsying clumsily. His smile lit up the sky. What perfect bone-white teeth! I'd never seen such a thing. "Are you from this fair town?" he quietly inquired. It took my mind a second to register what he'd said, so entranced was I by his appearance and that wonderful voice. "No," I finally replied, "I come from far from here in Sirong province. I live here, though." I felt so stupid, but I didn't care. It was a wonder I could answer him at all. I felt like I was going to melt into those beautiful eyes. No man had ever had nearly the effect on me that this one did. He nodded. "I thought as much," he said. "You are Hira, are you not?" My jaw literally dropped at that. His spell was broken by my shock and my quickly rising anger. How had he known? Was he from Mulan? Or maybe someone sent by my father? I didn't know him, knew that if we'd ever met I would have remembered no matter how much time may have passed. So how had he known? I shook my head, more to clear my thoughts than to deny his accusation. "Good day, sir," I said curtly and quickly turned and started to walk away. "Don't go, Mary." I spun around, shocked past the point where I would have thought I could be shocked no more. At that moment I would have sworn to the Queen herself that I had just heard my grandmother's voice. But that was impossible? "What did you say?" I demanded. "Please don't go, Mary," he said, and it was his voice and not my grandmother's that I heard. "I'm sorry that I scared you. You have nothing to fear from me." "How did you know my name?" His smile grew brighter, something I wouldn't have thought possible. "I know everything about you, Mary." I walked straight up to him, my still lingering anger overcoming my common sense. "Who are you?" "I am the Son of Man," he said, his face becoming serious. "I am the Savior of man." "You are a prophet?" I asked, almost laughing. "I am the one who fulfills the prophecies, Mary." I stared at him. Was this not blasphemy? "Walk with me, Mary. There is an important place for you in God's plan." "I doubt that," I said with a snort. Was this man insane? "Walk with me, Mary, we must speak." I have much to do this morning." Those things can wait, but God waits for no man. Or woman. Walk with me, Mary. I don't know why I didn't turn him down a third time, but I didn't. Without waiting for any real sign from me of assent, he took my hand in what was an overly familiar gesture that somehow felt right, and led me away from the well pool. He led me to the outskirts of city and then out of the northern gate. The 3 men who were obviously with him followed, but still at a goodly distance. He said nothing as he led me through a fig grove and to an old oak tree that grew at the far end. He sat against the tree and I sat facing him, the shade of the tree keeping us both sheltered from the hot early morning sun. You do not believe that God has a place for you in his plan, Mary? He finally asked, speaking for the first time since he had bid me to walk with him. No, I do not, I replied simply. Why do you feel so? You know why, I evaded. Because you are Hira? My heart sunk at the sound of that word, but there was no longer any anger. I nodded. Why did you deny what you are? He asked, his voice reproachful. What would you have me do, have it branded upon my forehead? No, of course not. You are a beautiful woman and that is all that most will need to know. But you should not deny what you are. I shouldn't? I asked, incredulous. Never. I shook my head. You have no idea, do you? I do not know about where you come from, but here no one would accept a Hira. Where I come from all are accepted, Mary. Well, this is not that place. I said, not really believing him. Hira must hide her past if she's to have any life at all. And what kind of life is that, Mary? Has denying yourself made you happy? Or has it made you lonely and lost? My life is just fine, thank you, I replied curtly, not even believing it myself. Is it? Have you forsaken God, Mary? God has forsaken me, I said angrily. He has forsaken all of my kind. God will never forsake you unless you forsake him, Mary. You know not whereof you speak. Have you listened? Do you not know what people say of the Huron and Hira? That we are infested with demons, devil children, soulless, godless evil. People say we are the forsaken, and they are right. What people say matters not, Mary, what matters is what God says. You know this, do you not? All I know is that a smart Hira denies what she is if she wishes to have any kind of life at all. Whatever God may say does not change how a life can be destroyed if people know that you are different. You have been hurt, I understand that and I am sorry for it. But not everyone who has known you or Hira has rejected you. My grandmother, I said. How did he know so much about me? Yes. Did you wait in Mulan to see if they would understand? I couldn't. You couldn't even give them the chance? Give yourself the chance that some of those good people might have seen what had really happened and would have sided with you? I couldn't take the risk, I replied, the words ringing hollow in my own ears. He nodded. You ran. You've been running since that day in the cave. You can't run forever, Mary. Yes, I said, rising, I can. You're too young to be so hurt, Mary. Let me help you, let me share some of your burden. I must return to the city, I said, tears in my eyes. The market will be crowded by now. He nodded. Return to your labors then. But think upon what I have said. I will be here for 3 more days, Mary, giving sermons here in this field. Come again and see me, will you? Yes, I lied. I wanted to get as far away from this man as I could and never see him again. Mary? I jumped, sure that he had seen into me and through my lie and was about to call me on it. Yes? God has not forsaken you. I spoke the truth when I told you that there's an important place in His plan for you. I had to hurry to finish my business in the market and get back to the villa before the hottest part of day descended on the city. I tried desperately to work on my latest projects, but could not. I could not concentrate. I wanted to put that man out of my head, to forget his words and to try and forget the effect he had on me, but I could not. I could not stop thinking about him and wondering. Eventually the mistress of the villa, the other Mary, came to see me as she often did. Finding me in such a state, she was concerned and wanted to know what was wrong. I needed someone I could talk to, so I told her about the man I had met by the well pool, carefully avoiding mention of his damning recognition of what I was. Mary was intrigued by my story. No, it was more than that. She was excited in a way that I had never seen her. Unlike myself, I knew her to be a deeply religious woman, and I would have thought that she would reject this man who said he would fulfill prophecies out of hand. But she did not. Instead, she said that he sounded like a holy man. She said that my having heard my grandmother's voice and his knowing my name and where I had come from were proof. Even though there were numerous possible explanations for both, I had to wonder myself. When I told her of his invitation to come and hear him speak that evening, she immediately decided that we both must go. I declined, which upset her more than a little. She cajoled me at some length, even becoming a little cross with me for the first time that I could remember, but I did not want to have to see this man again. His effect on me was too strong. Finally, Mary gave up on trying to convince me, and returned to the villa still somewhat upset. By the time late afternoon had come, I had still accomplished nothing. I simply could not concentrate. I could not get him out of my mind. Mary came to me dressed in clothes more befitting a woman of my station than of hers. She sometimes dressed thusly when she intended to go into the market or a few other parts of the city that were less safe for the wife of a rich man than for a servant. She asked me again to come with her, and while I wanted to decline again, I could not. I had managed to do nothing save think of his words since that morning. I had to find some way to get him out of my mind. Perhaps going to hear him sermonize would help. Mary was joyful as we made our way through the city to the northern gate. She seemed to feel that whatever connection I had to this man she felt might be holy, it must be important. It seemed like it had almost changed the complexion of our relationship for that time. As though I was now the important one and she was following in my wake instead of the other way around. He was still beneath the oak tree where he had spoken to me that morning, sitting and talking to the 3 men I'd seen with him earlier. Various peoples were seated in expanding semicircles going out from where he was. Some simply sitting on the grass, others sitting on woven reed pallets, the richest among them seated on expensive blankets. It was not a huge crowd, but it was a lot of people. I was slightly amused to note that there were more women than men in the crowd. Apparently I was not the only one affected so by this man. Certainly that was true by Mary's reaction. When she saw him, she took an involuntary breath and then sighed loudly. No description of mine could have prepared her for his great beauty or the preternatural sense of calm strength he exuded. Mary wanted to find a place near the front of the crowd, but I insisted on sitting farther back. That she didn't protest nor demand to have her way confirmed my previous sense. Somehow she felt it was important to do things my way. She didn't even complain or even mention the indignity of sitting in the grass and dirt, though of course it would be up to one of the servant girls to remove whatever stains resulted. We had just found a spot in which to sit when a hush came over the crowd. I looked up, and he was standing now. He was standing quietly, waiting for people to settle, and I could have sworn that he was looking directly at me. That was ridiculous, though. Why would he be looking at me alone out of all of the people before him? How would he even know that I was there? It wasn't just me, though. I looked to the side and Mary was looking at me, an odd expression on her face. Several other people around us had also turned to see what had gained this man's attention. My cheeks grew red. I was very uncomfortable. Not so much because of his distant attention, but instead because of the attention that had drawn to me from the crowd. For too long, he started, his magnificent voice carrying easily over the crowd, our people have been divided. For too long we have argued minor points of insignificant law, endlessly debated different interpretations of scripture. For too long we have fought amongst ourselves, made enemies when we should be making friends, we have gone to war over perceived slights. Many in the crowd were nodding, these were common sentiments shared by many. We have lost our way, he said. Instead of following the ways of the God of our fathers and mothers, we follow priests and priestesses more interested in building beautiful churches and shrines to their own glory than in bringing the people to the glory of God. For too long we have followed leaders who were more interested in conquest and power than in serving God. For too long we have followed only our own individual needs and wants, ignoring the needs of others and the calls of our God. We have become lost. There was shock from many at that, as well there should be. But also nods of agreement from many others. I have not been sent here to tell you what you want to hear, but instead what you need to hear. God has sent me as a shepherd to a lost flock. I am here to show you the way back to God's righteousness. It is up to you, good people, whether or not you will follow. I hardly got any sleep that night. He had spoken on, the crowd completely in his thrall, until well past sunset. When we had finally gotten back to the villa, Mary had stayed with me in my cottage, talking almost to dawn. She was a torrent of words and emotions, excited by his sermon beyond anything I would have thought her capable of. Several times she mentioned the way he had looked at me when he'd spoken, as if picking me specifically out of the crowd. She hardly seemed to notice that I was far less excited than she was. To be sure, much of what he had said was true and had touched my heart, but I did not believe in the God he spoke of the way she did. Or, if I did believe in him, I did not believe he was my God any longer. I could hardly tell her that, nor, especially, why I felt the way I did. I worried for her. She seemed far too eager to believe this man, to follow his words. To be sure, there was much about him to inspire such feelings, but she didn't seem able to see that there was much he had said that was virtually guaranteed to bring trouble. Once they heard of what he'd said, the church was bound to denounce him because of his harsh words for the priesthood. Never mind that he was right, the church took far more than it gave, that was not the problem. The problem was that the church had great power. Still more power was held by the politicians, who would also not be very happy when they heard about what he'd said about them. None of this seemed to occur to Mary, however, especially odd as her husband was part of the power structure this man's words threatened. Mary was clearly missing something in her life, something she felt that this man might fulfill, and that was all that mattered to her. When finally she grew weary and hugged me before going to her rooms to rest, I made some tea and quietly watched the sun rise on a new day. A day, I suspected, that would not be like the one that had come before it. Kyrie eleison, follower. The next evening Mary was again insistent that I go with her to see him. The passing of the day had not diminished her excitement any, if anything it had only grown. I put up a token resistance, but agreed to go. He scared me, especially his unnatural knowledge of me scared me, but I couldn't make myself truly wish to stay away. I had to hear what he wished to say. The crowd was at least double what it had been the afternoon before. It seemed as though half the city had turned out to see him and hear his words. There were also several priests and priestesses present, obvious by their robes and their refusal to sit. I expect that they intended to be intimidating, both to him and to the crowd, by their simple presence. If that was indeed their intention, they were unsuccessful. Rumors and claims were running rampant. One could hardly sit among the crowd, as Mary and I did, and not hear them. Not that Mary wasn't quick to relay whatever she'd already heard, a surprising amount, to me in quick torrents of excited speech. I discounted much of what I heard, knowing all too well how rumors could get started and how often they had nothing to do with the truth. The most surprising rumor, at least to me, had to do with him supposedly healing a man in the market just by the laying on of hands. A man who had been lame from birth and who now could walk. I'd heard this story from Mary on the way to the field and then again from a man sitting next to us in the crowd. All I could do was shake my head. The very notion struck me as ludicrous. Even if he was indeed a holy man, as Mary and so many others believed, how could he just heal a man like that? How could these people believe that? It was as though the entire city had come to believe in children's stories overnight. I worried about the potential backlash against him when people inevitably discovered that, right or not, wise or not, holy or not, he was just a man and not the answer to all their problems. It was clear that people, at least a lot of them, did believe he was something more, though. At the front of the crowd, very near the base of the tree he'd stood under when he spoke, were several people that I could only presume were there hoping to be cured. A man who had obviously been carried, laying on a pallet and seemingly unable to move his body much, if at all. A woman whose arm was bent and gnarled. At least 3 lepers. Several others whose problems were not obvious but who were in among the others. A hush fell over the crowd when they saw him and the 3 men who always seemed to be with him walking towards the tree from the direction of the fig groves. The 3 men seemed tired, but not him. No, he was full of life, you could feel it coming off of him like rays from the sun. The 3 men held back as he walked up the small hill to the tree and then turned to face the crowd. Without even looking over the crowd, he looked right at me and nodded. This time I couldn't tell myself that it was my imagination. As had happened before, Mary and many of those in the crowd turned to look at me. I could only imagine what some of them were thinking. He turned away from me, slowly scanning the rest of the crowd, and then rose his arms. "Let us pray to our Father in heaven," he said. Around me a sea of heads bowed in prayer. Even the priests and priestesses bowed their head. I was the only one I could see who didn't. I didn't worship their God, at least not the way they did, and I didn't want to disrespect him or them by pretending to pray to a God I believed had long ago abandoned me. There was some tension in the crowd. I think they expected him to lead them in prayer the way they were led in the church, but he said nothing. I watched as he apparently said a short prayer to himself, then opened his eyes and went to each of the sick and injured who were laid out in front of him. He bowed his head in prayer in front of each of them and then placed his hands upon them briefly before moving on to the next. After he'd finished the last, he returned to his place under the tree and motioned for all of them to rise. Amazingly, stunningly, unbelievably, they all did. I blinked for a long moment, not believing what I was seeing. Several of them seemed to be almost in shock, as unable to believe what had happened as I was. But the man who'd seemed to be nearly immobile was dancing. Dancing! Dancing and making enough noise to cause many of those praying in the crowd to open their eyes. Seeing something that had to be a miracle, they in turn nudged their neighbors until everyone in the crowd was looking at the now apparently healed sick and wounded with as much amazement as I was. It had to be some sort of trick. But how? I had seen some of these people before. Probably everyone in the crowd had seen one or another of them begging in the market or by the well pools. I myself recognized at least 2 of them. Others in the crowd clearly recognized some of them as well, as there was the buzz of hundreds of conversations reaching a fever pitch as the once immobile man continued his little musicless dance. He raised his hands again. This time it took quite a lot longer for the crowd to grow quiet. "Go," he said to those he'd healed, "and give thanks to God for your healing." He looked up, addressing the rest of the crowd. Prayer is a powerful thing. God hears our prayers, each and every one. The priests and priestesses, he continued, a flash of anger in those beautiful eyes, wish to tell you how you should pray. They wish to pray for you, say the words that you should say. That is not how your God would have you pray. His voice rose in volume and intensity. Your God wishes to hear your words, your worship, your thoughts, your feelings, your worries. Your God wishes to share your burden, to in that way be a part of your life. Your God does not wish to hear words put into your mouths by those who wish only to build up their own importance. God wishes you to come to him, not to those in beautiful robes who would put themselves between God and his people. There was a priestess standing not 10 feet from me, and I turned to watch her as he spoke. She was clearly angry at his words, her fists so tight that I had to wonder if she wasn't cutting herself with her long nails. She wasn't going to get any happier either, he was only getting started. I didn't even bother with the pretext of telling Mary that I didn't wish to go see him on the third evening. After what had happened the previous night, the entire city was abuzz with talk of him. I had to admit that I was beginning to wonder if he wasn't a holy man myself. It was impossible to deny the miracles he had performed, never mind the way he had known so much about me. Was it true? Was he truly a prophet? The prophets were from old times, or so I'd been taught. Holy creatures from ancient times. People you read about in the holy texts who had a special connection with God. They put forth his laws, foretold what would come, and performed miracles of God's grace. But the last prophet had come so long ago that no one was exactly sure how long. They were something from our past, some even thought that they hadn't been real people. A prophet in this day and age? It seemed impossible, ludicrous, and yet here he was. We made it to the field earlier than we had the previous 2 nights. Apparently a lot of other people had the same idea, as the crowd in front of the tree was already substantial. We looked around for a place to seat ourselves, and I had just decided on a spot when suddenly there was a man standing in front of me. I hadn't even seen him walk up, and he startled me. It was the odd-looking brown-haired man, one of the 3 who were always with him. "Miss," he said, bowing low. I curtsied wordlessly, happy that I managed at least some grace in the uncertain grass and dirt, keenly aware of how silly such formalities seemed in the middle of a field. "I am Marcus," he said, "a follower of Zakar." Zakar? So that was his name, how odd-sounding. "I am Mary," I said, "I have seen you with him, I hope all is well." "It is, Mary, thank you." "This," I said, indicating Mary, "is my miss." "A friend," Mary interrupted. "A friend of mine, also named Mary." "Miss," Marcus said with a smile, bowing to her as well. Mary could barely contain her excitement as she curtsied to him, nearly tripping over her own skirt. "He wishes to speak to you," Marcus said to me, and then he glanced at Mary, alone. Mary was crestfallen at that, Marcus must have noticed. "I will be glad to keep your friend company while you are gone, if that would be okay?" "If it would be all right with her," I replied, feeling like I was being propelled along by circumstance against my better wishes. "Certainly," Mary said, her face brightening. Apparently getting a chance to talk to a follower of a holy man was almost as good as getting to meet the holy man himself as far as Mary was concerned. "You will find him behind that hill," Marcus said, pointing. I nodded and walked in the direction he'd indicated. It didn't take me long to find him. He was sitting on a large rock by a stream and motioned me to come sit with him. "I didn't know if you would accept my invitation or not," he said. "So you don't know everything?" I said with a smile, trying to make it sound like a joke. "Of course not," he replied, his face brightening. "I know only what my father chooses to reveal, and that is far from being everything." He tossed a small pebble into the stream. "Besides, life would be pretty boring if I knew everything that was going to happen. I carry enough of a burden as it is." What burden is that? I asked as I adjusted my skirts and sat next to him on the rock. I like you, Mary, you speak your mind. In all my time, in all the places I've been, I don't think I've ever met one quite like you. Do you know why you were the first one I went to when I came to this city? No. I had wondered. Because in all of Takla you are the only Hira. My father told me to seek out a Hira or Hiran I would find in this city. Why? I asked, not sure if what he said was an insult or flattery. God's people have been led astray, Mary, have let themselves be led astray. They no longer follow the true path that God wishes them to follow, the path of righteousness, truth, and happiness. I have been sent to lead the people back to the true path God wishes them to be on. That responsibility is my burden. I don't understand what that has to do with the Hira and Hiran, what it has to do with me, I said. Your people have perhaps suffered the most, Mary. God has not condemned you, but the church that claims to speak in his name has. You have been told that God has forsaken you, and many of you believe it. You believe it, and thus suffer without your God. You hide everything about yourself, you live in fear, when you should be able to celebrate your uniqueness, your part in your God's grand design. He tossed another pebble into the stream. I come to you first, Mary, because if I can reach you then there is hope that I can reach all of those others who have been led astray. So you go to the lowest of the low first, I said, deciding that this was indeed an insult. He smiled. Something like that. Though you certainly are not low. You have done well for yourself, have you not? Far better than many of your kind manage. As you say, only by hiding what I am. I hope to end that, Mary, I hope to bring you into the fold. All God's people are important to him, all are equal. You belong with the God of your father and mother, not wandering all alone. I do not know if I wish to follow the God you speak of, I said. He nodded. I know, and that has to be your choice. I can only show you the way, what path you tread is up to you. Then what do you ask of me? I will be leaving Takla in the morning, Mary. I have many places yet to visit, my message must get out to all of the land. I wish for you to follow me, to come with me and give me a chance to reach you. To share your burden, teach you, and hopefully to bring you back into the fold. I looked at him, incredulous that it was clear he was serious. I can't just up and leave. You've done it before, he pointed out. Only because I had to. I've worked hard to make a life for myself here. I can only ask, Mary, it is up to you to follow or not. He stood and jumped down from the rock. I leave for Lamar in the morning, in case you change your mind. I can't, I said, I won't. Perhaps, perhaps not. However you might decide, we will meet again, Mary. That much I do know. I sat on the rock, thinking, as he walked off towards the crowd around the tree. After a while I could hear him speaking to them, though I could not discern the words, and I could feel their excitement. Takla would not soon go back to being the city it had been before his visit, of that much I was certain. Perhaps he was a holy man, perhaps even a prophet, but why would he ask me to follow him even after I'd told him that I did not worship the God he spoke of? Follow him? The very notion was insane. As if I should just throw away my life to hear his words. I wouldn't even seriously consider doing such a thing. Without realizing how much time passed, I sat on that rock for the rest of the night. I was actually surprised when the sun began to rise, even as I welcomed the early morning warmth of its rays. My mind was a tempest of chaotic thought and I didn't know why. Why was I even thinking about this, contemplating what he'd said to me? Did I, deep inside, really believe that he was offering a true path to me? Was it curiosity or desperation? I led a good life. For the most part, things were going well for me. Why should I even be thinking about throwing all of that away on what amounted to a whim? The sun was just starting to clear the distant mountains when I rose, dusted off my dress, and headed back for the city. The villa was busy with various servants going about their duties. It was well into morning when I got there. I went straight to my cottage and, without giving myself time to think about it, started packing my things. There was much more to pack than when I'd left Milan, but only so much I could bring with me. A stable boy nervously helped me to hitch my horse up to my wagon and then to haul my things and get them situated. "You're going to follow him?" A voice from behind me asked as I was tying down the last of the things I was going to bring with me. I turned to face her. It was cowardly of me, but I'd hoped to leave without having to tell Mary. "Yes," I replied, "I must." "I know," she said, hugging me. "There's something special about you, I've always knew that." "There's nothing special about me," I said, shaking my head. "There is, and there's certainly something more than special about him." I nodded. I couldn't deny that. "Is there room for another in your wagon?" she asked. "You?" I was more than a bit surprised. "He speaks to me, Mary, he speaks truths that no one else has ever been willing to say." "I must know more." "But your responsibilities here?" "The villa will be fine without me for a while." "And your husband?" "Would not deny me this." "Besides," she said with a smile, "he's not here to stop me. He'll be in Sarlong province for at least 2 passings of the small moon overseeing the new plantation." She paused, growing more serious. "So will you bring me with you?" "Of course," I said, nodding. "I could use a friend on this journey." She smiled and hugged me again. It was well into the afternoon by the time we had Mary's things packed and in my wagon. Zakar, Marcus, and the other 2 men would have left long before us, but as far as I knew they were on foot. I was sure that at the very least we would catch up to them in Lamar. We made good time, traveling well into the dark that night, despite the risks of a broken axle or being waylaid by bandits, and, on the next day, into that night as well. It was crazy, of course. 2 women alone on the road? Almost an open invitation for any number of nasty things to happen to us. I'd wondered if Mary would want to hire some men to come with us and guard us, but she didn't. We seemed to be of a mind on this. It was something that we had to do by ourselves. And, for reasons that neither of us could explain, we both felt that nothing bad could happen to us while we were on this journey. Whether by design or by happenstance, we were right. In the late morning of the 3rd day since leaving Takla, we entered the outskirts of Lamar. Lamar was a somewhat smaller city than Takla, but still a city in its own right. I had never been there, but Mary had, and after we found boarding for my horse and wagon, she led the way to the market. We assumed that the easiest way to find those we're seeking was to ask around there. It didn't take long to hear word of them. They had gotten there the evening before us, apparently making even better time than we had, and he had already given his first sermon. It wasn't as though people there hadn't already heard of him beforehand, we found out. Word was, even then, starting to spread quickly. We found them in a field just outside of town. He was sitting in the grass and the men were sitting around him eating pulla meat pies. There were 4 of them now. Where the 4th had come from I did not know. We approached quietly, standing a respectful distance away until he noticed us, stood, and motioned us forward. The other men stood as well. "I am glad that you decided to follow, Mary," he said, taking my hand. I stood there wordlessly. His touch was like nothing I'd ever felt. And you, he said, turning to my companion, are Mary, daughter of Moriah. I am honored by your presence and thankful that you are such a good friend. I am honored that you know of me, Mary said, curtsying deeply. There is no need of that, he said, smiling as he took her hand also, here we are all equal. Mary seemed as shocked by his touch as I had been. Come, he said, sit. We have much to discuss. Kyrie eleison, the miracles he is the Messiah, Jacob said, breaking the silence that had fallen over us as we ate. We've all thought it, why are we afraid to say it? Several of the men nodded, as did Mary. I was a bit surprised at such speculation, but passions had been running high amongst our little group, and his having gone into the desert, he said that he needed to be alone to pray, only drove them higher. In the almost 6 passings of the small moon since Mary and I had met up with him in Lamar, we had been through 3 more cities and countless towns and villages. Always people turned out to hear him speak in large numbers, and they brought their sick and injured to be healed. Several times along the way we had picked up new followers. Besides him, our core group now consisted of 9 people, 6 men and 3 women who were dedicated to following him wherever he might lead. Besides us there were usually a dozen, sometimes far more, people who followed him perhaps from one town to the next, sometimes farther. But with the approach of the holy day of Aliyah, and since his going into the desert to be alone, there was only the 9 of us to sit and wait for his return. What do you think, Mary? Marcus asked me. Why ask her? Jacob said. She's always the doubter. Because she's not given to jumping to conclusions the way some of us are, Marcus replied reproachfully. Jacob grunted. Besides, of us all she's perhaps the closest to him, the other Mary said quietly. You can say that again, Judah said. I glared at him. I'm not sure that I like your tone. Of them all, Judah was the only one I did not like. I didn't like him one little bit, and little comments like that were exactly why. Ignore him, the other Mary said. What do you think? About what? I asked her. You've read the sacred texts, Jacob said. You know of the prophecies. Yes, I told him, I do. Do you think he is the Messiah? Mary asked. I smiled to her. I wasn't sure I liked the changes that had come over my friend since we had started out on our journey together. She was much more subdued now, much quieter. I couldn't doubt the intensity of her beliefs, and that we were near polar opposites, but I was not sure if all of this had been very good for her. The weight of knowledge and of the journey seemed to have aged her. It was more than that, though. She seemed almost afraid of him now, and almost afraid of me. There was something more, something in her eyes when she looked at me, something I couldn't place and was unwilling to ask her about for fear it would drive her away. She was my closest friend, the closest friend I'd ever had. I didn't want to push her away. I don't know, I said. He is certainly a holy man, of that not even I can doubt. No man could perform the miracles we have all witnessed unless his God was with him. Is he a prophet or even the Messiah? I don't know. I don't even know how he might feel about such speculation on our part. Will you ask him? She said after a moment. I could almost feel everyone holding their breath, waiting for me to answer. I wanted to tell her that she should ask him herself, but the look in her eyes stopped me. There was fear there, but fear of what? The answer he might give? I will ask him, dear Mary, I finally said, I promise. She smiled and nodded a thank you to me. I will say this, I said, and then wondered if I should just keep my mouth shut. What? Mila asked when I paused. If he is the Messiah, we're all in trouble, I said with a sigh. Why is that? Judah demanded. Think about it, I replied a bit testily. People expect the Messiah to be a great king who will ride in on a great horse. They expect someone who will lead them in battle, defeat our enemies, bring us all peace and prosperity as he rules over us. Most everyone around the table was nodding. We all knew that it was true. They expect one of the great kings from the sacred books, Marcus said. He is many things, Mila said, but he is not like them. Exactly, I said to her. So you hope he isn't the Messiah? Judah asked, for once without the dripping sarcasm or innuendo. No, I replied, hating as much to admit it to him as I hated to admit it to myself. I hope he is. But if he is, I fear for him, I fear for us all. You seem troubled, Mary, he said to me the morning after his return. We'd waited for him a whole 40 days, some had begun to fear he would never return to us. For whatever reason, I'd never doubted. After his return he'd slept through part of the day, through the night, and late into the next morning. It was very unusual for him, he rarely seemed to need to sleep or eat much at all. I need to speak to you, I said, remembering my promise to Mary but dreading the asking and the answer I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Walk with me, Mary, he said, taking my hand and leading me to the edge of a stand of trees. What troubles you? He asked after we'd sat. While you were away there was much talk amongst us, and much speculation, I said. Yes? I took a deep breath. Are you a prophet? He smiled. I am much more than that, Mary. I told you when we first met, I am the one sent to fulfill the prophecies. You are the Messiah? Yes. A simple answer, exactly what I would have expected of him. But then you already knew that, didn't you? In my heart of hearts, I replied. He nodded. And that knowledge frightens you? Should it? Have faith, Mary, he said with a smile. I know that is hard for you, but have faith. Have faith in God's plan, have faith in me. If I didn't have some faith somewhere inside me, I wouldn't have been there. But it still scared me. For 3 years we traveled the land. For the most part it seemed like he had no set path or pattern. He said that he simply went where his father asked. If there was a corner of the land we had not been to, a place where they had not had the opportunity to hear him speak, a person anywhere who had not heard of him, I could not imagine where or who that might be. In that time our small group had grown to 13, 5 women, 7 men, and him. Beyond that, there were often hundreds following us, most for only a short ways to the next village or town to hear him speak again. They brought their sick and injured, they followed, sometimes they crowded us, trying to get a look at him, even trying to touch him. Some of the men had tried to keep the crowds at bay once or twice. A futile exercise, and one he asked them not to engage in. He wanted to be with the people and, sometimes to the point where it seemed almost foolish, did not fear them in the least. We were witness to his performing more miracles than I could ever recount. At times it got to the point of almost being mundane, and then he would do something that amazed yet again. Seeing what he did, no one, not even I, could deny that there was a God and that this was his chosen one. There was no wound, no ailment, no disease, no deformity he could not cure. The lame walked, the sick became well, the infirm were made strong again. He even somehow returned a hand to a man who had lost it in battle. But the healing, as wonderful as it was and as important as it was to those he healed, was nothing compared to some of the other miracles we witnessed. Once, when we were in Omanon, a dam broke not far from the city. We barely were warned by the thundering noise of a wall or water higher than 4 men bearing down upon the village. The village would have been wiped out for sure, we would likely have all died. But he simply commanded the waters to stop. And it did, that wall of water hung there as if held back by an invisible barrier. Slowly over the next day that wall of water dissipated, flowing out through the nearly overflowing river. The village and all in it were saved. The very forces of nature were his to command at will. I witnessed as much on many occasions. But that was not the most amazing thing we witnessed. The most amazing thing was that he had command even over death. We stayed in Lorland for nearly 7 days, a long time for us to stay in any one place. On the 4th day he had gone to the forest to be alone and pray. This was not unusual for him to do, and the rest of us stayed in the town and patiently waited for his return. A wealthy man, Jonah, had offered to allow us to stay with him. This was again often the case. He was a town elder, and while not a young man, he was not old either. But not more than half a day since Zakar had gone, Jonah came down with an illness that forced him to his bed. His wife, Lana, and I stayed with him in his room trying to comfort him. All of us hoped and prayed for Zakar's quick return. Surely he could heal Jonah and everything would be right. But he did not return, and through the night Jonah got worse, much worse. His breathing became labored and his fever grew so hot that I could barely touch him. The next morning Mila, Judah, and Marcus went into the hills to try and find Zakar, but by then I feared that it might be too late. It did not seem like Jonah was long for this world. My fears were only too right. That afternoon Jonah died. I was there myself when he took his last breath. Neither Lana nor I had left Jonah's side since this had started. He was well and truly dead, no breath, no heartbeat, and his body grew cold. There was much sadness amongst us and in the village. Jonah had been well loved. That evening the two of us who had been with him when he had passed performed the rituals and wrapped his body, preparing him for burial. The next morning, after the proper words were spoken, he was interred in his tomb. Early that afternoon Zakar returned. Mila, Judah, and Marcus were not with him. They had not found him and were probably still looking. Knowing that something was wrong, he came to me. I left Jonah's wife, we had been trying to comfort her, and went out with him. "What has happened, Mary?" he asked me. "Jonah has died," I replied, sighing. I knew that he had been quite fond of the man. "No," he said, his face contorted in pain. I'd never seen him like this and it worried me. "Yes, it's true. I was with him when he died." "I'm sorry." "No," he said again. "Bring me to him." I didn't know what to do, how to comfort him, so I simply obeyed and led him to Jonah's tomb located just outside of the village. He frowned when he saw the entrance to the tomb, blocked as it was by a large stone. He turned to me and nodded, then knelt in the dirt and prayed. The way he was acting scared me a little and I backed away a few paces, almost expecting him to explode in hurt or anger. Death was a horrible thing, yes, but his reaction seemed so extreme. I don't know how long he knelt there, but it wasn't long before a few people from the village started showing up. Apparently someone had seen us go to the tomb. Mila, Judah, and Marcus also showed up, almost walking into us. It seemed they hadn't known we were there, they'd simply been returning from their unsuccessful search. I motioned them to be silent as they joined me. It must have been apparent to them, because of our presence at a tomb, what had happened. The sun was just starting to sink beneath the mountains when he finally stood. Nearly the entire village, including the rest of our group and Jonah's wife, had shown up and were waiting silently while Zakar paid his respects to his dead friend. We all wondered what he would do. As he stood there for a moment, his shoulders set as if he intended to push the entire hillside all the way to the sea. He pointed to the stone that had been placed at the entrance of the tomb, a boulder large enough that it had taken 6 men with levers half the morning to get it into place. "Move," he said simply. The boulder obediently, inexplicably, rolled out of the way. Everyone in the crowd, including myself, nearly dropped our jaws in amazement. Arise, Jonah, and come forth. It is not yet your time to rest, he said in a clear and loud voice that all could hear. He paused for a moment while we all held our breath. Begone, death, he commanded. He is not for you, not yet. I command you in the name of my Father, begone. He paused yet again. Arise and come forth, Jonah, he said, this time in a softer voice. There was a noise from the tomb, a cry, and the crowd surged forward to see what was happening. Zakar held up a hand, stopping everyone in their tracks. Jonah appeared at the entrance to his tomb. The wrappings we'd carefully placed around his body were partially ripped away. He looked confused, as a man who has just awoke from a very deep dream and is not yet sure he is in the real world. Zakar went to him and wordlessly took his hand. He led him to the crowd, to his wife. I have returned your husband to you, he said. It was not his time to leave us. Jonah's wife promptly fainted. We stopped not more than a day's travel from Nerin. The holy day of Rona was 7 days away and he wished to be in Nerin well before that for reasons that he didn't explain. Nerin was the largest of cities in the known world. The capital of all of the provinces, it was a place of legend. A place of wealth such as none of us could imagine. It was said that living in Nerin was almost like living in heaven. I was nervous about our prospects of entering Nerin. Since he had raised Jonah, his legend had grown exponentially. Stories were told that were even more fantastic than what had really happened, and now there was much talk about him being the Messiah, the King of Kings, that was not restricted to just our little group. There was much talk, within our group and without, that upon entering Nerin he would take up his proper mantle and become our king. I had my doubts that anything like that was his intention. It just didn't feel right, knowing him as I did. And there had been many run-ins with the church, especially of late. He had long spoke out against the church, but the church had seemed content to try and intimidate where it could, ignore what it couldn't stop. Now, I think, they were nervous. He had also spoken out against our secular leaders. Rightfully in my opinion, but he was sometimes perhaps not prudent about it. And here we were about to enter the seat of power for both the church and the political leaders on the eve of one of the holiest of times? This definitely worried me. We had set up camp for the evening, as we often did, a small distance from the road. Jana and I were making dinner, cooking rabbits the men had caught and some vegetables we had foraged. Everyone else was sitting around resting. Or talking. Mila and Nerin were deep in discussion on some issue or other with him. Without any warning we were suddenly surrounded by at least a dozen men. Bandits, by the look of them, all of them were armed either with swords or bows. In all of our travels we had never been waylaid by bandits. It seemed almost ludicrous to be attacked this close to the capital city. Zakar rose, a smile on his face. He was not nervous or afraid in the least, but then he never was. Greetings, he said. That seemed to throw the men more than a bit, and sure they were not used to being greeted so openly by those they were about to rob or kill. One of them, a shortish tough-looking man wielding a scimitar, stepped forward. He was apparently the leader of the group. You are he? He asked. The one they call Zakar? I am. The man motioned to his men, who all obediently lowered their weapons. I will have much to answer for when I am called before God, the man said, sheathing his own sword. I will not add attacking a holy man to the list. He motioned to his men again and they all turned to leave. Will you not stay? Zakar asked him. The man turned back, a scowl on his face. Are you inviting us to sup with you? Yes. You're aware we were about to rob you? Kill any who resisted? Perhaps take your women? Yes, but you did not. There is hope for you yet. You are an odd one, holy man, the bandit leader said. He thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. We will sup with you if you will have us. We don't have enough food, Lord, Rian said. Everyone in our group called him Lord now. Everyone save me. There will be plenty, he replied, have faith. I looked at Rian and shrugged, she just smiled. Somehow there was enough, but I'll never know how there could have been. The bandit leader and his men settled in around our camp, many of the bandit men seeming rather nervous at this odd turn of events. Rian and I finished preparing the food and Zakar blessed it, giving thanks to his father for the bounty the earth had given us, and we started serving. We had collected only enough food for the 13 of us, but as Rian and I served the food there always seemed to be more. There were 15 of the bandit men on top of the 13 of us, and yet when all had finished there was still food left over. Rian laughed at that, I could only shake my head at the impossibility of it. The bandit leader's name, it turned out, was Liam. He didn't seem to know how to take all of this, but then I wasn't sure myself. He was respectful, especially to Zakar, not something I would have expected out of a bandit, and seemed almost afraid. You said there was hope for me, Liam said to Zakar after he had finished eating. There is hope for you all, or I would not be here, Zakar replied. What does that mean? Liam asked. I have been sent by my father to heal the world, Zakar said, to bring his people back to him. You can be healed, Liam, you can change your ways and walk with God. But the choice is yours. If only you knew the things I've done, holy man, Liam said with a sigh. I do not think there is enough forgiveness in the world for me. I know everything you've done, Liam, every single thing from the moment you were born until this very day. I tell you again, you can be healed, you can change your ways and walk with God. God's forgiveness is infinite, do not doubt that. Liam stared at him for a long moment, as if wondering if Zakar did indeed know everything he'd done. I didn't have to wonder, I knew that somehow he did. I would like to hear more, Liam said. Zakar smiled. Apparently he spoke with the bandit leader the entire night. When I awoke the sun was just cresting the horizon and the two of them looked as if they'd hardly moved. A few of the bandits were sleeping, but rest of them were sitting around their leader, also listening intently. I woke Mary, Jana, Mila, and Rian, and we started tending to the camp. Breakfast needed to be prepared and things needed to be packed for our travels. Mark and Judah were already taking down and packing some of the tents. The rest of the men were missing, off getting food for breakfast. As I cooked up some eggs and bread from what provisions we had, I had to watch and wonder at the scene before me. That the bandit leader had stayed to hear even the beginnings of Zakar's teachings was nothing short of a miracle. That he had stayed all night to listen? If such a man could indeed be saved, be turned from his path of evil, perhaps there was hope for all of us. Even me? I shook my head as Marcus and Peter returned with some fish they'd caught. Jana and Mila started to clean them, they would be a good addition to our breakfast. What about me? I firmly believed in Zakar and his message. He was so right about so much, he said things that needed to be said but which no one else seemed willing to say. That he was a holy man who walked with God, I could not doubt. It wasn't just the miracles, though those were persuasive, it was everything about him. God was in everything he said and did. I was even willing to believe that he was the Messiah. I was no expert on the sacred texts, no priestess, but for my own reasons I had spent much time reading through them in my youth. He was not the image that came to mind when one thought of a Messiah, but if you thought about it the whole thing started to make sense. It was not a king to save the land that was needed, it was souls that needed saving. Saving from the politics, the wrongs of the church, the wars, the evil, the hatred. He was not what one thought of when one read the old prophecies, yet he had already fulfilled so many of them. And, not that I'd ever had any real doubt, having seen and heard so much, there could be no doubt in my mind that the God he spoke of, the God he called his Father, was very real. There could be no doubt that this God had a plan, that all of this was part of it. I could not doubt that we were all a part of that. All except for me. I was a part of things, true. By default, I did much of the practical work of keeping our little band going. The others looked to me, I knew not why, for direction. And, yes, I believed in Zakar, if not with the fervor of some. I believed in what he was doing, I believed in our ministry, I believed that his God was real and that what he said about his Father's nature was true. But, still, I felt outside of things, somehow apart. For me it all came down to one simple question. If there was a God and there was, how could he have made me the way I had been born? All of the pain and misery I'd been through, all of the trials to become complete. Being forced to choose between my home and parents and my life. Being alone at such a young age and forced to hide who and what I was because of a mistake of birth. That's what I was, when you got right down to it, a mistake of birth. How could God have let me been born thus? He only would if he did not care about me. I was one of God's cast-offs. People said that we Hira and Hiran had forsaken God, and to that I said no. We were forsaken by God. I could be a part of this wonderful work because Zakar called me, because he wished it, and I could not, despite my feelings, deny him. But his Father had discarded me and could not call me back simply on a convenient whim. That I could not allow. So I remained slightly outside of all that we were doing. Some of the others called me the doubter, but it was far deeper than that. I didn't doubt the work, I doubted my place in it. And I had to wonder how many of my companions would tolerate my presence if they knew the truth about me. I had to wonder if any besides Zakar knew. If any of the others did know, they didn't say anything, thankfully, and I certainly wasn't going to tell them. I wasn't going to, couldn't, tell them why it was, what it was, I doubted. Kyrie liaison, Nerin. After breakfast, Zakar and the bandit leader walked into the forest alone, saying only that they would return in good time. The rest of the bandits seemed almost disoriented, for the most part, like men who had just awoken from a very long sleep. Several of them started helping with cleaning up and getting everything ready for our travels. We were glad for their help, but they still made me nervous. Especially because of the way some of them watched myself and the other women. Clearly these were not men used to being around women. At least not women that they couldn't have their way with if they liked. I shuddered at the notion but was also embarrassed at other thoughts that flittered through my mind. We had finished our labors, for the most part, and were ready to travel by the time Zakar and the bandit leader returned. The bandit leader called his men around him, and I thought that they would likely leave. Hopefully they would live better lives and not waylay any travelers who might be so unlucky as to cross their path. I am a bandit no longer, Liam said to his men. I will no longer walk in darkness. His men seemed less surprised by the bluntness of that announcement than I was. What we have done is wrong, he continued, it is a crime against God and man. We all know that, and we've all made excuses for our excesses. I will do that no longer. I will dedicate my life to trying to do good, to trying to help those in need. I know I have much to make amends for and that I can never fully balance the scales, but God is great, as is his forgiveness. He took a deep breath. I have decided to follow this holy man, he indicated Zakar, for as long as he will have me. To help him in his mission and to learn from his great wisdom. I ask those of you who can open your hearts and minds to God to do likewise. Those of you who do not wish to are free to leave. He turned to walk away, then paused, turning back to his men with an odd smile on his face. But know this, if I find that any of you harming others, I will stop you. He said something to Zakar that I could not hear, and Zakar nodded. You have all served me well, you have all followed me and listened to my wisdom. I ask you to consider that in making your decision. He then did turn and walk away, stopping to sit at the edge of the camp. Zakar followed, sitting next to him. Do you think they'll follow? Jana asked me quietly. I do not know, I replied. There was much discussion amongst the bandits, most of which I could not clearly hear or follow. Several times there were shouts of anger, several times men left the group and walked off into the forest. Eventually the men that were left seemed to reach a consensus. They went to where Zakar and the ex-bandit leader sat. One of the men, I counted 8 of them left, stood forward. Your words last night touched each of us. We wish to follow you if you will have us. Zakar smiled. You are all welcome. Liam stood. Take 2 of the men and go to retrieve some horses, he said to the man who had stood forward to speak. The man nodded and, pointing to 2 of the men, left. We travel to Nerin? He asked Zakar. Zakar nodded. Should I send some men ahead to procure lodgings for us? That would be good, Zakar said, thank you. See Mary, he pointed to me, about any monies your men will need. Money is not something we have any shortage of, Liam replied. Ah yes, we must speak of that. I thought we probably would. Our entrance to Nerin was unlike anything we'd yet seen. Word had gotten out, presumably from Liam's men who had gone ahead, that we were coming. That he was coming. People had come out in huge numbers, more men, women, and children than I'd ever seen in my life, lining both sides of the South Road into the capital city. The crowd had waited I know not how long for us to get there, their huge numbers a dull roar that we could hear even before we came over the hill and approached the city. Zakar was riding a horse Liam had provided, the first time I'd ever known him to ride and not walk. When we came over the hill and saw all of those people ahead, the rest of us halted in shock and surprise. Zakar rode on, though, Liam and 2 of his men hurrying ahead and forming a kind of honor guard. The rest of us followed. I worried about what the crowd might do, for the first time thankful to have Liam and his armed men, experienced in battle, around us. But the crowd, despite their obvious excitement, was amazingly well behaved. They had nothing but adulation for him. They poured flower petals in his path, lined the road with the leaves of the great palm, they cried out his name as one. The crowd closed in on him as he approached, people wanting to be near him, to touch him, to just be able to say that they had been there when the holy man came. A sea of people around him, somehow they managed not to impede him, allowing he and us to pass. Like a returning king, Zakar entered the capital city of the known world with the sound of the people crying his name in triumph echoing in his ears. The lodgings Liam's men had found for us were far nicer than anything we were used to. When they had tried to rent rooms and word had gotten out for whom, a wealthy merchant had offered them the use of one of his villas. They had offered to pay him, but he had declined. The villa was even larger and more ostentatious than Mary's husband's had been. It was certainly large enough even for our now enlarged party. And somehow it seemed appropriate, considering. Still, being in such a place brought back many memories for me. It was oddly confusing to feel like I had come full circle. I could see that being there was having an effect on Mary as well. I could only imagine what was going through her mind. She was even quieter than usual and seemed quite tense. My guess was that she was thinking about her husband and, no doubt, about her old life. She had several times along the way sent messages to her husband to try and explain her decision to continue to follow Zakar. Never had she gotten a reply of any sort. To be sure, The way we traveled, it wouldn't have been easy for a messenger to find us, but it wouldn't have been that hard. Especially not as Zakar's reputation had grown and word about where we were had started to travel further and further. Her resolve to follow Zakar wherever he went had clearly never faltered, but it would be perfectly natural for her to worry about her husband and what he might think of her. I wanted to talk with her of it, if for no other reason than to share the burden of the memories being in this place was dredging up, but there never seemed to be a right time and, oddly, she seemed to be avoiding me. The next day Zakar bid us to all rest. It had been a long time since most of us had been able to just do nothing, and at first I wasn't sure what to do with myself. I explored the villa grounds, finally settling on a bench set along a garden path. The day was bright, the sun warm on my face. Birds sang in the bushes and trees, butterflies danced from flower to flower, a small hare came out in front of me to eat some grass. It was so peaceful, so relaxing. It was too easy for sometimes to forget how beautiful the world could be. I felt more connected to the world than I had in a long time. "May I join you?" I looked over. Liam was standing next to the bench. I nodded to him, indicating the bench. He smiled and sat. "This is a very beautiful place," he said. I nodded again. Liam continued to surprise me. I wouldn't have thought him a man who would notice beauty, let alone appreciate or comment on it. "They say that you have followed this holy man for a long time?" "He has a name, you know," I said, smiling. "But, yes, it has been some time." "It seems somehow disrespectful to call him by his name," Liam said, seeming a bit embarrassed by that. I nodded. "You're not the only one who feels that way, many of the others do as well." "But you do not?" "No. The others respect you greatly," he said after a moment. "Mila said that you have been like a mother to all of them." "Silly girl," I said with a smile. "You call her girl, but by all appearances she is older than you by no small amount." I shrugged. Chronologically, I was one of the youngest of our group. "You are a very strong-willed woman, I respect that." "Thank you," I replied, feeling my cheeks brighten just a little. "They also say that you are the doubter?" "They say quite a lot," I said, feeling slightly cross. "Do they not?" "It's not him I doubt, if that's what you're asking." "What then?" "I do not wish to discuss it." He nodded. "Why do I feel like entering the city is an ending and not a beginning?" he asked after a moment. "I do not know," I replied. I was unable to say I had not had the same feeling. "What will he do now?" Liam asked. "Why ask me?" I said, surprised. "They say you are his chosen." "We are all his chosen, sir," I said. Rising, I took his hand in mine. "Including you." He stood, watching me intently. "I'm glad you're with us." I turned and started back towards the villa. "Thank you, Mary," he called after me. I smiled. In the early afternoon, I gathered Jana and Mila and told them we were heading for the market. Two of Liam's men, I didn't even know their names, attached themselves to our little party. They had apparently, perhaps on Liam's order or perhaps not, decided that we needed guarding. The idea annoyed me and I tried unsuccessfully to tell them to stay. But when I saw the crowds that had gathered in front of the villa walls, I was glad for them. Perhaps having two armed men with us was not such a bad idea. I briefly wondered if two would be enough. The city was bigger than anything I had ever imagined, and more crowded. It took us some time to make our way to the market. That too was bigger than any I'd ever seen, and yet I was told that it was only one market area of many in the city.